To an update here at 6, both the state and the defense have rested their case in the trial of a Waco man accused in the 2020 shooting death of a motorcyclist in ARP. 32-year-old Joshua Tibbits of Waco is accused of engaging in organized criminal activity in connection with the death of Brandon Edwards. Tibbits is also accused of being a member of a motorcycle gang. The prosecution claims Tibbits and at least one of his co-defendants shot and killed Brandon Edwards because he was impersonating a member of the gang. KLTV7's Christine Guevara joins us live in studio. And Christine, the last person to testify today, explain the definition of a criminal street gang. So the question is, why would that be important to the jury?
Blake, that definition will help the jury determine whether the shooting death meets the charge of engaging in organized criminal activity. Today, a special agent with the Texas Department of Public Safety defined a criminal street gang as 3 or more persons having a common identifying sign or symbol or an identifiable leadership who continuously or regularly associate in the commission of criminal activities. The special agent says this is significant because the Ugly Man Cossacks meets that statutory definition based on the organized activity of shooting and killing Brandon Edwards. The witness recalled the interview with one of Tibbits' co-defendants who claimed they were just trying to mess with Edwards.
To my understanding, it was going to be to harass in terms of driving behavior, and then also, if possible, get out and assault him if possible, or with other things that we have seen throughout this investigation. Shooting is not beyond the realm of possibility.
One of Tibbits' co-defendants testified yesterday they did not think they killed Edwards in the shooting, wanting the jury to believe it was not a premeditated act. On Monday, the jury will hear closing arguments from both sides starting at 9 a.m. in the Smith County Courthouse. The jury will begin deliberating after that. Reporting in the studio, Christine Guevara, KLTV 7 News.
All right, Christine, our thanks to you. Today